This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Welcome to episode 10 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I can't believe we're up to double figures already. If you as a listener have been having even just half as much fun listening as I've had making these podcasts, then I think we're doing something right. So thanks for listening so far. In episode 10, we're going to be talking about how to cope in another language when you travel. Now, I have to admit that travelling somewhere where I don't know the language isn't really something that stresses me out, but I know it's a real stress for some people. I was trying to think about why this might be for me, and I thought maybe it's because I did start to learn other languages pretty young. I think I was about 7 years old when I started learning German in school, and at the same time I was taught by a family friend. And then I spent that 6 months in Europe when I was 9, and I saw my parents, who couldn't speak any really not a word of another language, getting by fine using sign language and pointing and whatever needed to happen. So I think perhaps that's why I don't feel too anxious going somewhere where I don't speak the language. I always try to learn a bit of the local language before I go somewhere. Last year when we were headed to Iceland, my son and I spent quite a lot of time watching these pretty cute YouTube videos that a lovely Icelandic woman had made to help teach us some phrases in Icelandic. And of course, once we got there, I used them, but everybody reverted to English with me pretty quickly. I guess my Icelandic accent still needs a bit of work. But in any case, it was still fun to know just some basics, and we had a lot of fun doing it. So I tried to think of some stories from my travelling life where not knowing the language proved to be a real difficulty for me, but I actually didn't. So that's encouraging if you're concerned about going travelling somewhere where you don't speak the language, is that it often really turns out okay. But because I know lots of people do get worried about going to a place where the language is completely foreign to them, I've gathered quite a few interesting tips today from some very experienced travellers, and I hope that these tips will help put your mind at ease. So my first guest today is Leyla from Women on the Road. So Leyla is massively multilingual. In fact, she confessed in this interview that English is actually her fourth language. And when you listen, you'll know that she sounds completely fluent in English. So you can imagine if this is her fourth, and there's many more after that she's one of those very talented multilingual people. And she grew up moving around with her parents, being put in schools in different countries all around the world. And she said she grew up thinking languages were friends, which I think is such a beautiful way to grow up. But in any case, she is aware that it's not so simple for everyone. And in this interview extract, she has some very useful thoughts and tips.
Absolutely. So I have some coping mechanisms, though, that I've learned, because just because I speak some languages does not mean I speak them all. And when I get to a country that is very foreign, where I'm going to stay for more than a couple of days, I mean, if I'm going to stay for 2-3 days, I will learn please, thank you, and where. But otherwise, I'm not going to learn much more. But if I'm going to stay a few weeks or a few months somewhere, then I'm going to make an effort to learn a few basics. And let me share with you the most useful phrase that I have ever learned when trying to capture a new language where I've been. And that phrase is, what is the word for? So you just pointed something. If you know how to say, what is the word for, then people will tell you, then you'll pronounce it several times back and forth, and you will gain a word for your vocabulary. And this is how I learned Thai, is by walking around and pointing at things and asking, what is the word for that? What is the word for that? And I built out my vocabulary.
That's actually really genius. It's so simple, but I've never heard anyone say that before, and it's actually
it was accidental. I just wanted to be able to point at the pineapple and make sure that I could get that every day, even if it wasn't on show. So I had to learn the word.
No, that is super, super clever. I'm going to remember that. What is the word for?
That's a perfect
Right.
place to
And
learn.
so I think for me, there's a couple of things that you really have to learn. One of them are your numbers.
Mm-hmm.
And then your basic pronunciation, like just keep talking back and forth with people, just bounce words off them until they look at you in despair and send it back pronounced correctly. Because I've seen some people who have a very good vocabulary, but whose accent is so bad that they're incomprehensible. Yes. Whereas my accent, I have the other problem. My accent is very good. So I can say I don't speak XYZ in many, many languages, and people just think I'm insulting them.
Yes, they don't believe you.
What do you mean you don't speak it? Listen to you. Of course you speak it. You just told me in perfect, whatever.
Yeah.
And so that's a bit of a drawback. So sometimes I'll put on a kind of American or British accent when I'm speaking so that they can quite clearly see that no, just because I can pronounce that one sentence does not make me fluent in the language.
Yes, that's true. That can be a problem, can't it? And I'm sure, yes, you must have grown up with such an ear for the sounds of different languages that's a simple thing for you to adopt a new
Exactly.
Accent.
Yes. Yeah. The sounds are simple. And the other thing I would recommend too is for people to carry a notebook, because the thing is, I know we have apps nowadays, and we have apps that mean that you never have to learn a foreign language again.
Which is a real shame,
we are becoming so dumb. I mean, we're at the point where we don't have to learn anything. We don't have to memorize anything. I mean, this dumbing down of society is not something that I'm in favor of. And as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to language, I use a pen and a little notebook. And what I do is I ask the question, or I show the word, or I get them to write it down. And that way I actually have to concentrate on the word or the phrase as opposed to not even listening to it and shoving my iPhone in somebody's face. Now, if you really, I think there is a place for that kind of thing. And they are very useful if you're in an emergency or if you're just passing through somewhere and need some quick information. Absolutely. I mean, I have iPhone language apps on my phone too, so I'm not denigrating them. But they do not replace learning a language if you're going to be anywhere for any length of time.
I think Leyla has some really great tips there. And my favourite is definitely her suggestion to learn the phrase, what is the word for X? And be able to point to something when you're in a new country, because I think that's a great way to firstly be able to interact somewhat with the locals, and secondly to add to your vocabulary with really useful things that you can see around you. Great idea. I'm going to use that definitely next time. Now, our next guest today is Kerstin Pilz of Travel Pilz, and she's another one of these very multilingual people who I'm somewhat envious of, and she loves to go to places where she doesn't speak the language. I think she loves the new challenge and the new languages she might hear. So she has some tips for us as well, and also a really important reminder that it's not just the words of a new country which we need to think about when we travel.
It's one of the pleasures for me of traveling to actually go to a place where I don't speak the language and I have to somehow get by. I actually traveled through Greece for 2 months when I was really this is sort of my virgin trip. I hitchhiked there from Germany after high school. And in those days, again, not many people spoke English, and somehow I picked up some Greek and I got by. I've not really, obviously in India, you might have a problem, but somehow I've always managed to get through.
That's really excellent. It's amazing to me to hear you say that it's like one of the pleasures of travel is going somewhere where you don't know the language, because most people will say that's one of their biggest fears, is not being able to make themselves understood. So I guess experience has shown you that it's always possible.
Yes, obviously it can be frustrating because you don't know what to order. If you're in a place, in Japan it's easy because you can see the little plastic imitation of the food, but in some countries it's not. So then you just, I did that recently actually in Thailand, where I couldn't make myself understood. So I thought, well, I'll just have what he's having, and I didn't realize he was having intestines in broth, and I thought, okay, well, I paid for it. It was very cheap, but I didn't need it. So then I and I think I was a bit worried that they might get offended that I didn't finish it, but they were smiling, and I think they realized that was a bit of a stretch for a foreigner.
Yes, exactly. I don't think I would be eating that one either. Oh, that's hilarious. Do you have any special tips for people who are worried about not knowing the languages? Like, how do you use nonverbal communication best, or do you also learn a few particular phrases, or what do you do before you go to a new country?
Yeah, I mean, I personally like to learn a few, key phrases. I don't know, thank you, hello, good morning, and so on, the numbers, because it just puts people at ease and it puts a smile on their faces. I guess there would be a lot of apps available now. I've never used one because I'm a pre-app traveler. And also, I guess the reason why I particularly enjoy the challenge of not being able to communicate in the language is because I ended up being a teacher, not only of teaching languages at university level, but actually intercultural communications. So where we had to take the students through a lot of scenarios and train future managers in the different communication styles that the other cultures have. And many cultures, or rather many of these expat assignments actually fail due to, intercultural communication differences, whereby maybe an American who is very much, me, and aggression and, directness might mortally offend a Japanese, but they would never show it because it's all about the loss of face. So in Asian cultures, you have to be very considerate of the fact that loss of face is a very, very big issue. So you never insult Asian people to their face. And also, if you want something, you don't, come out straight up. You might have to have a bit of small talk beforehand, and you might have to find a different way of getting your message across, not in that very sort of direct, let's talk business style. So I would always advise perhaps not only to worry about the actual words of a foreign language, but also the non-verbal communication skills. And again, these days with the internet, you can just Google it. There's beautiful websites for every country now. I saw one recently, I think it was a Canadian one, where they tell you the sort of the salient features of every culture. There's some obvious ones like don't point your feet at somebody in an Indonesian house or don't touch people on the head. But there's a lot more and a lot of subtle ones as well. And that sometimes also will really help you, get out of trouble. I mean, I once, for example, in Italy at the time, this is a long time ago, I was selling things that I bought in Indonesia, jewelry and so on, at the markets in Italy, in southern Italy. And this was near Naples, and it was sort of Camorra, mafia territory. Mm. And I could speak Italian very well. That was not the problem. And I needed to get the permission of the local, what do you call it? The mayor, the mayor. And so we went to the mayor's office, and it was, one of those very Italian, very Byzantine, bureaucratic, go to this place and then fill out this form and so on. And and in the end, I didn't realize at the time what I should have done is just slip them, a note of money, and it would have been totally fine. And that's the way to do it. But I did it the way that I thought was the right way.
Of course.
And afterwards I thought, of course, this is how you. Yeah.
Yes, even though it might even feel morally wrong to you, it's actually the cultural way, and that would have just made everything simpler.
Yeah.
I think Kerstin makes a great point about it not just being the words that are important when we're communicating in another language and another culture, but it can be quite tricky to get that right, but I think also a lot of fun. And to me, I'm always fascinated by the cultural differences in a different country and different languages. So I think that's all part of the fun. Okay, my final guest today is David Soto Jr., who is from the Primitive You site. So he is a bit more normal and like the rest of us. He can't speak 55 languages the way that our previous guests can. Okay, 55 might be an exaggeration, might not. But in any case, this is a quick story from David about the first time he was in Italy and trying to practice his Italian, which he'd been trying to learn from some CDs, I think. And he stumbled across a nifty little trick in being able to speak the language more fluently and easily.
I think about my first time in Italy, it was with the military again, right?
Right.
So this was, 1996, I went to Italy with the Air Force. And we went to a location where, I don't know if this counts as travel, but it's my first time in Italy. And
it totally counts.
We went to a town called Rimini, and I'm not sure which city it was, but when we entered the city, right? We were replacing the first rotation. So the people who went there, we were replacing them. And when we entered this city, there was a sign, and the sign said, Sister City, Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And I was like, wow, that's a great sister city. And here I am in Italy. So right off the bat, the crew that we replaced says, all right, you guys don't have to go to work tomorrow, so we're going out first night in country. And they took us out. And the thing about this military location was it was not supposed to be known that we were military, and there wasn't a military location there. So it was kind of secret. And there wasn't a lot of like when you're on a military base, outside of the base, everybody knows, the business, and everybody knows that the GIs bring a lot of business, whether it's bars or restaurants or shopping. And
sure.
But this place had no idea that we were there. And it was because there was an airport close, that's where we worked out of. But it was a holiday, like people in Europe went there on holiday. Rimini, Italy. If you look it up, you'll see. Just beaches, and it's still, it's almost 20 years ago, and it's one of the best experiences I ever had.
Oh, great.
Because we got paid a lot of extra money to be in this beach town city in Italy. And so we would go out, we worked till we gone. When we had to work, we had to work. But when we didn't, we went out. And everybody was trying to speak Italian. Everybody was trying to adapt. And they would order their food. And well, I felt that I had a perfect into the Italian language because I grew up Mexican American in California. And then although I didn't speak Spanish, I heard Spanish my whole life. So when I started hearing Italian, I was like, oh, I know what these words mean. And we go out and we're drinking. And I remember sitting I would sit at this table with my old friend, and I don't remember his name now, but we'd sit there. And we'd sit there for what seemed like hours, and we're conversing and going back and forth and talking. And I'm like, I'm speaking great Italian. This is awesome. And we order another whiskey or whatever. And this interaction happened. Like it happened various times.
Right.
Another night, like I'd go to work for 3 days, and then we come back, and then it's time to go out, time to party again. So we would go out. And there's this old guy, and he was an older gentleman, probably, in his 60s, and he would drink whiskey, and I would drink beers, but we converse. And then one morning, after all these conversations, I go for a walk on the beach, and when I'm walking back, I see this guy. Mm-hmm. I wish I remember his name. And I see him, and he's eating breakfast in a restaurant on the beach, that has a table on a sidewalk. So I walk up to him, and I see him, and I say buongiorno. He says buongiorno, and I said, if I remember, I said che cosa, and he says mangiare, or I don't even remember exactly what the words, the tense is there, but
I have no idea.
He's saying, I'm eating, and I say, oh. And we both, he sat there and I stood there, and we're bobbing our heads. And I said, okay, ciao. And he said, ciao. And I left. And that's when I realized we could not carry on a conversation sober. And I realized that my Italian is not as good as I thought it was. And I always remember that.
That is really funny, and it's so true that you can be way more fluent in a language under the influence of alcohol, because half of the problem with speaking another language is we always have these concerns about making mistakes and stuff, and often yes, a bit of alcohol loosens that up, and you can just talk all night. That's really funny. So that's the final tip for the day to cope in another language. Grab a glass of wine or a can of beer and you'll be fluent in no time. I'm not encouraging you to go out and get, massively drunk or anything, but I think that somehow finding a way to relax and not be too stressed about making mistakes is actually a way that really helps you take more risks when you're speaking another language. I actually remember when I was teaching ESL here in Perth to students, some of whom who were going to take English exams to try and enter university here. And one of my colleagues who shall remain completely nameless, did encourage the students to just have a small glass of something before their speaking exam so that they were able to loosen the tongue a little bit. It's a weird thing that we're often so scared of making mistakes in another language, and I absolutely am. It's still something that bothers me, even sometimes, even in German, a language I'm pretty fluent in. But still, sometimes, depending on the situation, I will seize up and say nothing rather than risk making a mistake. And I think it's a perfectly normal thing. So don't stress and just try and relax. That's my tip. Okay, so thank you very much for listening to episode 10 of the Thoughtful Travel podcast. I hope you've learnt something useful about how to cope in another language. If you have any other tips, then do let us know and we can share them with the other listeners. You can get in touch with me on Twitter at Amanda Kendall. You can use the hashtag ThoughtfulTravelPod. And you can also look me up on Facebook at Not a Ballerina. And just leave us some tips and I will share them in a future episode. Big thanks to my guests again, especially our very multilingual people who had some really useful insights. So to Leyla Giray Alyanak of Women on the Road. You can find her online at www.womenontheroad.com. Heaps of useful advice, especially if you are a solo female traveller, but in fact useful advice for anyone. And similarly, Kerstin Pilz of Travel Pilz, which you can find at www.travelpilz.com. The Pilz part is Pilz. Has some really interesting stories from her travels around the world. And finally, David Soto Jr., who spoke to me from his van on a military base. I don't think there were any aircraft noises in that particular extract, but you might find some in future extracts from Dave. And you can find him at www.theprimitiveyou.com. Some really great stuff there. All of those details and more will be in the show notes. And for this episode, you'll find the show notes at notaballerina.com/10. Thank you so much for listening. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.
Jackrabbit FM. For your ears.
Who is that? Hi, podcast.